The text arrived while I was helping customers at my boutique. "I'm leaving you and moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already emptied our joint account." Ha ha ha. My hands didn't shake as I read it. My voice didn't waver as I helped Mrs. Peterson pick out a scarf. The only sign that my husband of 12 years had just nuked our marriage via text was a slight tightening around my eyes. I waited until Mrs. Peterson left, her purchase wrapped in our signature silver paper, before typing my response. "Good luck. My name is Claire, and at 38, I had just received the most callous goodbye in history." But while Mark was probably gloating over his grand exit, imagining me in tears over his betrayal, I was calmly locking up my boutique for the day. The signs had been there for months, the late nights at work that never matched his pay stubs, the sudden password changes on his phone, the way he'd started going to the gym religiously, buying new clothes, trying to recapture his youth. 3 months ago, I'd found a receipt for dinner for two at an expensive restaurant on a night he'd claimed to be working late. That same evening, I'd opened a separate bank account at a different bank. A week later, when he mentioned wanting to combine our accounts to simplify things, I'd agreed cheerfully, while moving my personal savings to the new account. The joint account he just emptied? It contained exactly enough to keep him from getting suspicious, about 2 months' worth of regular deposits. The rest was safely tucked away, along with detailed records of every suspicious transaction he'd made over the past year. My phone buzzed again. "Don't bother begging. Melissa and I leave tomorrow. I'll send for my things later." Melissa, the new receptionist at his office. I'd met her at the company Christmas party, watched her laugh too loudly at Mark's jokes, noticed how she touched his arm when she thought no one was looking. She was young enough to be his daughter, naive enough to think she was special. I didn't respond to his text. Instead, I called my lawyer, the one I'd consulted 2 months ago when I'd found the hotel charges on our credit card statement. "It's time," I said simply. "He just made his move." "The papers are ready," she replied. "I'll file them first thing tomorrow. Do you want me to have him served in Miami?" "No rush," I said. "Let him think he's won first." Another text from Mark. "I know this must be hard for you. You're not getting any younger, after all. At least you have your little shop to keep you busy." My little shop. The successful boutique I'd built from scratch, the one that generated more income than his middle management position, the one whose profits I'd carefully kept separate from our joint finances. I smiled, thinking of the certified letters that would greet him in Miami. Let him enjoy his moment of triumph. That evening, I spent time in our house, my house, since I'd inherited it from my grandmother and kept it in my name despite Mark's repeated suggestions to add him to the deed, another lucky instinct that had paid off. While organizing the paperwork my lawyer would need, I found our wedding album. Mark looked so different then, before his midlife crisis had turned him into a caricature of his former self. These days, he wore shirts too tight for his softening middle, tried too hard to connect with the 20-somethings at his office, and used slang that sounded ridiculous coming from a 45-year-old man. My phone kept buzzing with texts from him, each one more condescending than the last. "I've been planning this for months. Melissa understands me in ways you never could. You'll be fine. Maybe you'll find someone more your own age. Already told my family. They agree we grew apart. It's nobody's fault, really." I screenshotted each message, adding them to my evidence folder. Let him dig his hole deeper. My lawyer would love his casual admission of premeditation and his gleeful announcement about emptying our account. The last text caught my attention. BTW. I used the joint card to book our flights and hotel. Consider it my parting gift. LOL. Perfect. I called the credit card company. "Mrs. Harrison speaking. I need to report fraudulent charges and cancel a card immediately." "Of course, ma'am. Can you identify the charges?" 2 first-class tickets to Miami booked today, hotel charges at the Royal Palm, and I'll need to remove my husband as an authorized user. "Do you have documentation of the fraud?" Text messages from my husband admitting he used our joint card to book travel with his girlfriend after emptying our bank account. I'll be happy to forward them. The representative's professional tone couldn't quite hide her satisfaction as she canceled the charges. Mark and Melissa would arrive at the airport tomorrow to find their tickets invalidated and their hotel reservation canceled. The next morning brought a flurry of increasingly angry texts from Mark. "What the heck did you do to our credit card? The airline won't honor our tickets. The hotel canceled our reservation. Answer me." I silenced my phone and headed to my boutique. Friday was always our busiest day, and I had a new shipment of designer handbags to unpack. Life goes on, even when your husband runs off with a receptionist young enough to be his daughter. Around noon, his mother called. "Claire, dear, Mark told us everything about how controlling you've been, how you drove him away. He says you're being vindictive now, causing problems with his travel plans." I put her on speaker while I arranged a window display. "Did he mention emptying our joint account and charging tickets for him and his girlfriend on our credit card?" Silence. Then, "Well, he said you left him no choice, that you've been cold and distant." "Barbara, I have his texts. Would you like me to read them to you? The one where he bragged about taking our money, or maybe the one where he mocked my age?" Another pause. "He did seem a bit cruel. I told him that text message was inappropriate." "I appreciate the call, Barbara. I've always liked you, but I think it's best if we end this conversation now. My lawyer has advised minimal contact with Mark's family during the proceedings. Goodbye, Barbara." The emergency hearing on Monday was everything I could have hoped for. Mark showed up in his new young wardrobe, designer jeans too tight for his age, a blazer that screamed midlife crisis. Melissa waited outside, her youth painfully obvious under the harsh courthouse lighting. My lawyer presented our evidence methodically. Mark's gleeful text about emptying our account, his credit card fraud, his documented history of hidden expenses. Each piece had been carefully collected over months of quiet observation. "Your Honor," Mark's hastily hired lawyer attempted, "my client admits to some rash decisions, but Mrs. Harrison's actions have been vindictive and calculating." "You mean prudent," my lawyer countered. "My client protected her separate assets and maintained detailed records of her husband's suspicious behavior. That's not vindictive, that's smart business." The judge reviewed my documentation, the separate property deed to the house, the boutique's incorporation papers in my name only, the careful separation of business and personal finances that Mark had always complained about. "Mr. Harrison," the judge addressed Mark directly, "you admitted via text message to deliberately emptying a joint account and using shared credit cards to fund a trip with your girlfriend. Do you deny this?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. "I was just trying to make a clean break." "By committing financial fraud?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "And now you're claiming rights to property that documentation shows is clearly separate from marital assets?" "The business grew during our marriage," Mark's lawyer tried again. "My client is entitled to—" "The business was established before the marriage," my lawyer interrupted, "and Mrs. Harrison maintained strict separation of business and personal finances throughout. We have documentation of every penny invested and earned." The court found sufficient evidence of financial misconduct. All shared assets were frozen pending final dissolution, and Mark was ordered to return any funds removed from joint accounts within 24 hours. "But that money's gone," Mark protested. "We spent it on—" "Then I suggest you find a way to replace it," the judge cut him off. "And Mr. Harrison, the court takes a very dim view of using shared credit cards to fund adventures with paramours." Outside the courthouse, I heard Melissa asking Mark about their Miami plans. His response was lost in the sound of my heels clicking confidently across the marble floor as I headed back to the business he'd never understood or respected. The next few weeks brought a string of increasingly desperate moves from Mark. He tried claiming the boutique had been his idea, that he'd invested money in its early days, even suggesting he'd been my business partner all along, claims quickly disproven by my meticulous records. "He's getting desperate," my lawyer observed. "His girlfriend's social media shows they're staying at her studio apartment now. Apparently, living on a receptionist's salary isn't quite the glamorous escape he imagined." Mark's family started reaching out, their tone markedly different from their initial accusations. "We had no idea," his sister Amanda admitted. "He told us you'd been cold and controlling, that he needed to escape. But then we saw his texts, the way he bragged about taking your money. That's not the brother I thought I knew. His mother called again, this time in tears. The things he said about your age, about replacing you with someone younger. I raised him better than that. I thought I did. I let their calls go to voicemail. Their support might have meant something weeks ago, but now it felt like rats deserting a sinking ship. Ironically, the boutique thrived, boosted by local gossip about my situation. Women started coming in specifically to show support, often leaving with far more than they'd planned to buy. My ex tried something similar. One customer confided while buying a designer handbag. Thought he'd take everything in the divorce. Men like that never expect us to be smarter than them. My phone still buzzed occasionally with texts from Mark, his tone swinging between anger and manipulation. You've ruined everything. I never meant to hurt you. You'll regret being so vindictive. Can't we work something out? That business would be nothing without my support. I forwarded each message to my lawyer without responding. Let him dig his hole deeper. The final divorce hearing painted a very different picture from Mark's imagined triumph. Gone was his cocky attitude, replaced by barely concealed panic. Melissa was noticeably absent. She'd moved on to a co-worker her own age, according to office gossip. Mark had shown up in his old clothes. The designer wardrobe had apparently been returned to help repay the joint account he'd emptied. The judge's final ruling reflected my careful planning. I kept my house, my business, and my separate assets. Mark got his personal possessions and his car, which was worth less than he owed on it. "You've destroyed me," he hissed as we left the courthouse. "I'll have to move back in with my parents." "No, Mark," I replied calmly. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure you couldn't destroy me, too." His mother was waiting outside, ready to drive him to her house, his new home at 45. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd mocked my age was now living in his childhood bedroom while I continued running my successful business. 2 years after Mark's cruel text message, I received an invitation to speak at a women's business conference. The topic wasn't divorce or betrayal, it was about building and protecting a successful business. My story had evolved from cautionary tale to inspiration. The boutique chain had grown to 5 locations, each more successful than the last. The little shop Mark had mocked now employed 30 people and had been featured in several national magazines. Through mutual friends, I heard Mark had finally moved out of his parents' house into a small apartment above a garage. He'd had to take a lower-paying job after his former company downsized, eliminating his position during restructuring. His dating profile still listed him as young at heart, though his profile photo was clearly outdated. Melissa, ironically, had become a regular customer at my original boutique location. She'd earned her business degree and started her own social media consulting company. "You inspired me," she told me once. "You showed how a woman can build something lasting instead of falling for empty promises." I kept Mark's cruel text message framed in my office, not as a reminder of pain but as proof of how far I'd come. Below it hung a sign that read, "Success is the best revenge." At the 5-year anniversary celebration of my original boutique, I stood addressing my employees and loyal customers. The space had been transformed from a single, little shop into the flagship store of a thriving business empire. Mark's mother attended, though I hadn't sent her an invitation. She waited until the crowd thinned to approach me. "I saw Mark yesterday," she said, smoothing her designer dress, one she'd bought from my store. "He was talking about his glory days, about the life he could have had. He still doesn't understand that he didn't lose everything in the divorce. He threw it away." I thought about that text message, his casual cruelty, his assumption that I would crumble without him, how he'd expected me to beg, to break, to prove him right about my desperation. Instead, I'd built something stronger than before. Each new boutique location was a testament to what women could achieve when they stopped dimming their light for insecure men. The young saleswoman I'd hired last month, coincidentally also named Melissa, came over with a question about the new inventory system I'd implemented. As I explained the process, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the store window. I saw what Mark had failed to see 5 years ago. Not a woman getting older, but one getting wiser, stronger, more successful. His cruel text message had meant to be an ending. Instead, it had been a beginning, not just for me, but for every woman who heard my story and realized she deserved better than someone else's midlife crisis.